So I'm going to talk about visions. I'm going to talk about the first time I had a vision for my life. It was when I was, I'm guessing, very much your age. I was in high school, and I decided that I was going to be two things. I was going to be a fishing guide in the wilderness, and I was going to be a writer. I had loved fishing growing up. I loved reading adventure stories, and so I thought, well, that's what my life should be about, is I'm going to go find some wilderness that I'm going to get to know so well that I can guide people in that wilderness water, and then I'm going to write stories about it. So my sophomore year in high school, the very last day of school, I knew that waiting out in the parking lot, in our high school parking lot, were my parents, where they were waiting for me so I could begin my adventure to arrive on the English River in northwest Ontario, at Barney's Ball Lake Lodge fishing camp, where I was going to become an apprentice fishing guide. So I flew from O'Hare Airport to Minneapolis. I selected the bus from Minneapolis north to Canada that was going to allow me to sleep on the bus at night so that I didn't have to pay for a hotel room. I woke up in the morning at International Falls in Minnesota, crossed the border into Fort Francis, took another bus into Canada, into Ontario, hitchhiked the final distance to Kenora. And boy, you can imagine a 15-year-old's soul just was so well served when I was told that Kenora was a frontier town. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to be in a frontier town. And by designating it as a frontier town, what they meant to indicate was that it was in fact the end of civilization. It's where the roads ended. And there in Kenora on Lake of the Woods, some entrepreneurs, some former World War II pilots had bought bush planes, Cessnas and Norsemen and Otters, outfitted them with pontoons, and they would fly fishermen into the wilderness, and that's where I was headed, was to Kenora, where I was going to get on a bush plane that was owned by the camp owner, and I was going to fly into this fishing camp, and oh, what a wonderful fishing camp I knew that it was. I was going to be one of the few white guides. Most of the guides were Ojibwe Indian. In the United States, we call them Chippewa Indians. And it was a camp that attracted people like John Wayne, the movie actor. Ernest Hemingway's son used to be there as a regular guest. Not all of the guests were rich and famous, but many of the guests were rich and famous. Barney Lamb had built this extraordinary fishing camp in the wilderness, and that's where I was headed, with so much enthusiasm and so much passion, because my vision was on its way to being realized. Well, this is where the trip went bad, because I got on the bush plane, and on the bush plane along with me and the pilot was one other passenger, and we loaded 55-gallon drums of gasoline into the bush plane, because when you're a flying fishing camp, all the supplies, not just the guests, but all the supplies have to be flown into the camp. And so as we're flying out of Lake of the Woods, Kenora, to head north about an hour and a half on this bush plane to Barney's camp on the English River, the other passenger was the shopkeeper at the fishing camp, the man that ran the little guest shop at the fishing camp, and he discovered I was an American. In 1967, when the Vietnam War was raging, and when the rest of the world was finally beginning to sort of turn to America and say, you're a bunch of bullies. And this fella this Canadian shopkeeper on the plane spent the whole hour and a half just damning me for being an American, suggesting perhaps I was also a draft dodger. When I pointed out that I was still in high school, he recognized I wasn't a draft dodger, but just condemned me to the inner rings of hell because I was an American. That was bad enough, but the fumes from these gas drums began to fill the airplane, and while I had been in small planes before and hadn't had air sickness problems before, here I started to become airsick. And so on this last leg of my trip, for this most wonderful adventure that I was going to partake in, I'm being condemned for simply being an American, and I'm getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and I finally did succumb to air sickness, and I'm just getting off the airplane now at Barney's, and I'm on my back foot. I'm in the worst situation I could possibly be. And a young fellow who I knew for years as Little Stevie, an Ojibwe Indian boy who appeared to me to be a couple years younger than I. Again, I was 15. I discovered later was almost precisely my age. I don't know if he detected something. I don't know what he realized, but he knew I needed him. And as I got off the airplane, he greeted me with such graciousness and such warmth that I believed once again that this was going to be a grand adventure. Well, two things happened when I got to know Little Stevie. I'm serving this apprenticeship as a fishing guide this first summer, which meant that I was going to work for Barney for free for room and board, to do all the jobs that needed to be done to maintain this fishing camp, to make it a wonderful experience for the guests. Little Stevie and I were going to be work partners together in loading and unloading all the planes, seining for minnows, chopping wood, doing all the jobs. And then Stevie was going to take me out in the evenings to show me where to fish. I knew how to fish, I just didn't know these waters. So Stevie was very much a part of my apprenticeship in helping me learn how to be an effective employee here at the fishing camp. But here's what else little Stevie did for me. He was there in the mid-60s, a young fellow who had been born in a wigwam, a fellow who had been a part of a family clan that was very, very proud of the fact that it was one of the last off-the-reserve clans of Ojibwe Indians. They were living their life very much a hunter-gatherer life as their ancestors had, traveling up and down the river. Yes, they were augmenting that lifestyle now by taking guide jobs here at the fishing camp. But I had this opportunity to become part of this family of off-the-reserve Ojibwe Indians. And so Steve, as he was taking me out on the river to show me where to fish for smallmouth bass, would also show me the pictographs on this rock wall that had been there, as far as he knew, for generations before he had been there. I found out later for a couple of hundred years. And he would take me to the Indian burial ground where these Christian, yet also pantheistic people combined both Christian and their own faith in their treatment of their dead. And it was amazing to behold these graves that were a combination of Christian symbolism as well as their own symbols, totem poles and Christian crosses together over the same grave. What he also did was explain to me that just 2 years ago, before I met him, he had gone on his vision quest, that he himself had gone on a vision quest. And he began to introduce to me, not that I was ever going to participate in a vision quest within the Ojibwe culture because I was not of that culture. I'd never had any anticipation that I was going to take the final steps, but he began to introduce to me the preparation that a young Ojibwe Indian goes through to go on his vision quest. It began well before, by the way. So here's some of the things I learned about vision quests within the Ojibwe Indian culture. One is that they're very intentional. Very intentional. Everybody. How about that? How about being a part of a culture where everybody is expected to have a vision for their life? It's not the select few who have chosen yourselves because you know that there's something that's special that you've got to express in the way you live your life. Everybody in their culture is expected to have some purpose, some meaning for their lives. And when you imagine people living in a hunter-gatherer life, right, where life is tenuous, of course you have to live your life with purpose. You can't cruise through that way of living. So intentionality was one of the lessons that you learn from Ojibwe Indians when it comes to shaping a vision for your life. Another is preparation. It doesn't happen casually. It takes place over some period of time. The sweat lodge ceremonies that I participated in were for young men that were going to be going through their vision quest perhaps a year later. So there's a preparation over time in understanding and preparing yourself to receive the vision that's going to guide your life. So don't rush it, right? Nurture this time of developing this vision for your life. What the Ojibways also taught me was that preparation occurs within the community. Over that period of time, over that year or so that you're preparing yourself for your vision quest, you're in conversation with the whole clan, with the whole community, with all of the people with whom you live. Your role as a member of the clan is so important. You have to have this understanding of what your life is all about, reached communally, collectively. So that preparation takes place over time. It takes place within the community. There's also a spiritual leader. As important as the whole community embrace is of this individual, it's important to have an individual because you can't become intimate with everybody. Right? You can't tell everybody what's in your deepest heart and soul, but it's awfully important that you share that with somebody. So that there is a spiritual leader that is associated with this young man as he prepares to go through this vision quest. So there is this clear understanding that you should listen to all these voices as you're shaping your vision. Listen to all these voices. But then, of course, in the final time of the actual vision quest, there's also this appreciation that you can separate yourself from all these voices. In the case of the Ojibwe culture, you go away for 4 days. For 4 days, you go away and fast. Because not only now are you getting away from all these other voices so you can hear your own true voice, in a sense, you're getting away from yourself by putting yourself in that different state of mind, right? By fasting. Yes, they eat a few blueberries, eat a little wild rice, but they're pretty much fasting for 4 days and praying and out in nature so that they sort of lose themselves so they can hear their one true voice. So that's what we learn from studying those folks who have really embraced for centuries this idea that, yes, your life should have meaning. It should have purpose. Every life should have meaning and should have purpose. And that's how they've structured their vision quest. The current vision that I am motivated by now is a vision about your generation. I've come to believe that your generation, the millennial generation, is different in kind rather than different in degree from those generations that came before. I have been teaching at Duke for 12 years. I'm not an academic. I was an entrepreneur. They asked me to come teach a class on entrepreneurship 12 years ago. So I began to teach about the time the millennials were becoming juniors and seniors. And I've studied millennials. I've studied a couple thousand millennial students now in my classroom. And while the media talks all the time about all the negative attributes associated with millennials, I just don't see it. I just don't see it. Here's what I see in the millennial generation. I see a generation that, first of all, has got an extraordinary advantage that comes from the fact that the first time you've ever picked up a piece of digital technology, you picked it up as a toy. You played with digital technology. I was 35 years old when somebody sat me down in front of a PC for the first time and taught me how to use it as a word processing machine. And I still have to get sort of over those rule-based, my rule-based relationship with that technology to get anything out of it. Whereas the millennial generation, you played with this stuff, right? You played with it. It was an intuitive experience. It was a delightful experience. It was an exploration. And you couldn't do anything wrong when you're playing with it. And that meant you got to find all the things that this technology could do for you. So increasingly, as you use technology now as tools, and no longer just as toys, that creative, playful attitude will continue to inform your use of that technology. What a wonderful advantage that is. How significantly that carves you out to be different from and better than those who came before in terms of your ability to get all you possibly can out of that tool. So that's one thing that carves you out as different from. I believe that our economy won't ever recover. I don't believe it'll ever recover. It can't recover. It has to be renewed. And your generation and the unique qualities of your generation are going to lead that renewal. So this ability to play with technology and do it and leverage the best out of it is one important distinction. A second is that the status quo is the greatest impediment ever to creativity. Right? The status quo is the greatest impediment ever. Your generation is coming of age at a time when so many status quos are going away. The most fundamental status quos. The way that we, for instance, looked upon a family in America. Right? The most fundamental status quo. A man marries a woman, they stay married forever, they raise children in that household. That's the American family, and every other status quo is going to be built around that particular status quo. Nobody lives that status quo any longer, do they? Of course, some people still do, but very few do. When I ask my Duke students to raise your hand, if that describes your family, maybe half the students raise their hand. Right? So there's all these experiments taking place as to how we live our life in the most fundamental way, and how we order our lives in our married family relationship. And if that status quo is no longer going to be constraining and hold us into one particular option, then perhaps this generation will mature at a time where they'll say, okay, well then we can question all these other status quos that are getting in the way of making good, important, new, sound decisions. The third thing that carves this generation out so very differently, and this will be the last and then I'll wind down, is that while our older generation owe you all an apology for this economic morass that we've created and stuck you in the middle of it, where we have done you a service, us older generation have done you young folks a service, is in our human and therefore very flawed fashion. Right? This is not anything for us to be particularly proud of, which just finally has happened. We have finally made enough progress in the area of basic human and civil rights that within your generation, within your generation, everyone is allowed in the talent pool. Prior to your generation, of course not everyone was allowed in the talent pool. It's amazing that America accomplished as much as it accomplished, considering that for the longest time, it was only white men who were allowed to do anything of any significance. But within this millennial generation now, there has finally been enough overcoming of prejudices that women, people of color, people of different sexual orientations are all allowed in the talent pool in a way that they never were allowed before. And two really important things happen, therefore. One is that the talent pool gets much, much, much bigger, and creativity is a numbers game. You want to have a really good idea, have lots of ideas, so we got more people generating good creative ideas than ever before, and the talent pool is also much more diverse than it ever was before. And that's another important element of good creative thinking, is to have multiple perspectives on a problem or an opportunity. So that's my current vision. That's the vision that's driving me these days, is this vision of your generation as the first great creative generation. The generation that's going to lead the renewal of our economy, that's going to lead the renewal of all of our institutions. And so I'm acting now on that vision these days by, again, committing myself to teaching at Duke University and spending as much time with high school students as I can to open your, just to help you awaken to the wonderful opportunity. It all needs to be created out there. Nothing that has been done is the final solution. It all needs to be redone. It all needs to be recreated, and your generation needs to lead the way. So let's all applaud the millennials in the audience.